What if the worst day of your life became the turning point that changed everything? Jordan was humiliated and kicked off a plane, but what happened next will leave you speechless. Her rise to power wasn't just a story of revenge, it was a story of unstoppable transformation. Stick around to see how one black woman turned a racist attack into a corporate empire and the shocking twist that followed. Jordan sat at the airport, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. She was about to board a flight to the biggest business meeting of her life. If things went well, this meeting could change everything: her career, her future, and even the lives of the people who depended on her. Jordan had worked years to reach this point. She had climbed the corporate ladder despite the obstacles, despite the glass ceilings, and despite the everyday battles she faced as a black woman in a world that wasn't built for people like her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a quick reminder about the meeting. The chance of a lifetime. She smiled to herself, trying to calm her nerves. This meeting could change the direction of her career forever. She was ready for this, and nothing was going to stop her. She walked confidently towards the gate, ready to board. She handed her ticket to the airline attendant, a woman in her early 30s with platinum blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. The woman's name tag read Becky. The moment Becky looked at Jordan, her eyes flickered with something Jordan couldn't quite place. Something cold, something dismissive. "Do you have your boarding pass ready?" Becky asked, not looking at Jordan but rather at the computer screen in front of her. Jordan handed over her pass with a polite smile. "Here you go." Becky barely glanced at it before turning to another passenger. "Next," she called, dismissing Jordan without a second thought. A tight knot formed in Jordan's stomach, but she held her ground. She stepped forward and cleared her throat. "Excuse me. I think you missed me," she said, trying to keep the irritation from her voice. Becky finally looked up, her eyes cold. She seemed annoyed that Jordan had spoken up at all. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I'm on this flight," Jordan said, pointing to the seat number on her boarding pass. "It's right here." Becky's lips curled into a thin smile. "Oh, I see. Your bag's a little too heavy. It's against the policy to carry more than a certain weight. You'll need to check it." Jordan felt her blood pressure rise. She'd seen plenty of people with bags much larger than hers, and they weren't being hassled. "I've flown this route dozens of times," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "My bag isn't over the limit. Can you double-check it for me?" Becky's smile didn't change. "It's over the limit. I suggest you check it." Jordan's pulse quickened. She knew this was unnecessary. There was no need for this. "I've been traveling for years. I know the policy. If you could just measure it again." Becky's voice grew louder, now with a clear edge of condescension. "Ma'am, I'm doing my job. It's not my fault if you don't understand the rules." Jordan's mind raced. She was about to say something when she noticed Becky had already started checking in the next passenger behind her, ignoring her completely. Her body tensed, her patience wearing thin. But she held her ground. This wasn't the time for a scene. Jordan stepped aside and gave Becky a moment to do her job. She tried to remain calm, but her mind buzzed with the unfairness of it all. When she finally boarded the plane, the last few rows were cramped and the flight attendants were rushing through the cabin. Jordan couldn't help but notice that Becky was looking at her with disdain as she made her way to her seat. Jordan found her spot near the back of the plane, trying to push the feeling of injustice from her mind. She knew she had bigger things to focus on: the meeting The chance to change her life was all that mattered right now, but as she sat down, she could still feel Becky's eyes on her, a silent judgment that Jordan couldn't shake. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and for a brief moment, Jordan closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She would make it through this. She had to. But just as the plane started to ascend, there was a sudden tap on her shoulder. Jordan opened her eyes to see Becky standing beside her, looking down at her with an almost smug expression. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Becky said, her voice now dripping with faux politeness, "but you need to leave the plane." Jordan's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Becky's eyes narrowed and her lips curled into a smirk. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake. You need to get off the plane. Now." Jordan's pulse raced. "What are you talking about? I've done nothing wrong. I'm a paying customer, and I'm here for an important meeting." Becky stood there, unmoving. "I'm afraid you're causing a disruption. Please leave now, or I'll have to call security." Jordan was stunned. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now, but no one said a word. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something more. She was being singled out. No one else had been asked to leave, not even the passengers with bigger bags or those who had been loud or rude. Jordan felt a wave of heat flood her face, but she kept her composure. She stood up slowly and gathered her things. "Fine," Jordan said, her voice low but steady. "If you want to throw me off the plane, go ahead. But this isn't over. I'll make sure this gets handled." Becky didn't respond. She simply motioned for Jordan to follow her down the aisle. The other passengers stayed silent, some of them even avoiding eye contact. Jordan felt exposed, humiliated. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the weight of the situation settling in. There was no way this was happening. Not today. The moment she stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac, the door slammed shut behind her. She stood there for a moment, speechless, watching the plane lift into the sky without her. She could feel her anger rising, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just about a plane ride. It was about something much bigger. And as she stood there, watching the plane disappear, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The airport was a blur of sounds, announcements, rolling luggage, and the distant hum of airplanes preparing for takeoff. But all Jordan could hear was the rush of blood in her ears. She stood there on the tarmac, her stomach twisted in knots, staring at the jet she was supposed to be on, now soaring high above her, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had been humiliated, stripped of her dignity in front of dozens of strangers. It was unfair, unjust, and she wasn't going to let it slide. She didn't even realize she was pacing until she bumped into someone. The man looked at her, startled, but Jordan barely acknowledged him. Her mind was racing. What was she supposed to do now? Her flight had left. Her meeting was in just a few hours. She could try to catch another flight, but with the way things had gone down, she wasn't sure she could handle more delays or run-ins with people like Becky. "Are you okay, ma'am?" A soft voice broke through her thoughts. Jordan looked up to see a security officer standing in front of her, a look of concern on his face. He had probably been summoned because of the scene she had just caused. "I'm fine," Jordan snapped, more forcefully than she intended. She wasn't angry at him, but the unfairness of the situation had her on edge. She didn't want sympathy from anyone right now. She wanted action. She wanted justice. "I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave the tarmac," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. The airport's a secure area. You can go inside and wait for the next flight." Jordan's chest tightened. She nodded, but she wasn't really listening to him anymore. She was already thinking about what to do next. The injustice of what had just happened burned in her gut. She had been thrown off that plane with no explanation, no real reason other than the fact that Becky had decided she was trouble. It didn't make sense, and it wasn't fair. "I'll go," Jordan said, her voice a little calmer, but inside her mind was racing. She couldn't just let it go. Not this time. Something needed to be done, and she needed to take control. As she turned and walked back into the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket again. This time, it wasn't a reminder about her meeting. It was a message from an old colleague, someone she had met at a tech conference years ago. "Hey, Jordan, I saw what happened with the airline. That's messed up. I've got a contact who could help. Want to talk?" Jordan paused mid-step, her mind spinning. The message was short, but it felt like a lifeline thrown her way. It wasn't just a random person. This was someone who worked with investors, who had connections in the tech world. She had met them at a conference a while back, and they'd kept in touch over social media, but they weren't particularly close. And yet, here they were, reaching out to her. She stared at the screen, her heart racing. This could be the moment that changed everything. This could be her chance to take control of the situation, to turn everything around. She quickly typed back, "I'm interested. Let's talk." Before she could even process it, her phone buzzed again, this time with an email. The subject line read, "CEO position opportunity. Let's talk." Her breath caught in her throat as she clicked it open. The message was from a high-profile consulting firm she'd heard about in passing. The email stated that they had been following her career and were impressed with her recent work in business development. They offered her an opportunity to join their team as the CEO of a major corporation, a fast-growing company that needed someone with her expertise. Jordan felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had never thought something like this could happen. Not now, not after what had just transpired. She read the email again, making sure she wasn't imagining it. There was an offer, a real offer, waiting for her. The weight of the situation began to sink in. She was standing in the middle of an airport terminal, no longer just a passenger, but someone with the power to change everything. The mistreatment she had just endured could be the catalyst for something much bigger. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a journalist who had caught wind of the incident with the airline. They wanted an interview. They wanted to tell her side of the story. It was becoming clear. Jordan's story was going viral. People were talking. Her treatment had struck a nerve. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was becoming a symbol of something much larger, of all the black women who had been unfairly treated, dismissed, or ignored. Her heart raced as she looked at the messages and emails, her mind racing with the possibilities. This wasn't just a chance to get her meeting back on track. This was a chance to turn her entire career around. Jordan was no longer just angry. She was ready. She was going to take this moment and make it her own. Becky's racist behavior had just set something in motion, something she couldn't ignore. The anger she felt wasn't just a personal wound, it was a fire, one she was going to use to propel herself forward. With a determined look on her face, Jordan tapped out a reply to the email about the CEO position. "I'm interested. Let's talk." As she sent the email, she felt something inside of her shift. This was just the beginning. The small flame of anger, humiliation, and injustice was already spreading, and she was ready to turn it into a wildfire that would burn down everything in her way. Jordan's mind was still racing, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way to a quiet corner of the terminal. She needed a moment to process what was happening. The universe seemed to be throwing opportunities at her faster than she could catch them. But in the midst of all these new doors opening, there was still one thought she couldn't shake. Becky. She had been treated like an afterthought, an inconvenience, by someone who had no respect for her, no understanding of her worth. The more she thought about the way Becky had treated her, the more her anger bubbled up inside her. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was furious. But there was something else. She was more than that. She was determined. This wasn't the end of the story. Jordan sat down on a bench, took a deep breath, and opened her phone. She scrolled through her social media, mindlessly at first, until a notification caught her eye. Her phone was lighting up with likes, comments, and reposts. Her name was everywhere. News outlets were reporting on the incident. Hashtags like #Justice for Jordan were trending. It wasn't just her friends and family sharing her story, it was everyone. A movement was happening right before her eyes. Jordan's heart skipped a beat as she realized how quickly things had escalated. People were pissed off. The images of her being escorted off the plane had made their way across social media like wildfire. Passengers had recorded the whole thing, and now it was everywhere. Becky's name was being dragged through the mud. Some posts called out the airline for their mistreatment, demanding justice, while others called for Becky to be fired. But what really shocked Jordan wasn't just the viral nature of the story. It was the overwhelming outpouring of support. Messages flooded in from all sides, some from strangers who had witnessed the incident online, others from familiar faces who had experienced similar injustices. Jordan was no longer alone. People were rallying behind her, and it felt powerful. Among the dozens of messages of support was a personal one from an old colleague, one of the investors she'd met at a business conference years ago. The message read, "I saw what happened. You've got more power than you realize. Let's talk. I want to help you turn this into something big." Jordan's chest tightened as she read it. This was the moment. She wasn't going to let this opportunity pass. She immediately called the number in the message, her fingers trembling with anticipation. "Jordan?" The voice on the other end was familiar, warm, and confident. "I'm so glad you reached out. Look, we've been following your career for a while. We see what's happening right now. You have a chance to change the game here." The conversation flowed easily after that. They spoke for nearly an hour. The investor was excited about the potential they saw in Jordan, not just as a businesswoman, but as a leader who had the courage to stand up for herself in the face of such blatant disrespect. She could feel it. The momentum was building, and it was moving fast. By the end of the call, she had agreed to meet them at their office the next day. They wanted her to come on board as the CEO of a company that had been struggling to find the right leadership. They saw in her the strength, the passion, and the determination they needed. She felt something inside of her shift, as though all the pieces of her life were aligning in a way she had never expected. As she ended the call, she felt a quiet thrill spread through her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This was bigger than her. The next day, Jordan walked into the investor's office feeling like a different person. Gone was the anxious, unsure woman who had gotten kicked off a plane just a day earlier. In her place was a woman who had seen her worth, who knew she had the power to flip this entire situation on its head. She wasn't just a victim of racism anymore. She was on the verge of taking control of her own destiny. The office was sleek and modern, with polished glass walls and minimalist furniture. It looked more like the headquarters of a tech startup than a consulting firm. She was escorted into a conference room where a group of well-dressed professionals were waiting for her. The man who had called her yesterday was already standing, a warm smile on his face. "Jordan, it's great to finally meet you in person," he said, shaking her hand. "I'm Adam. We've been keeping an eye on your work for some time now, and we're very impressed." Jordan nodded, still a little overwhelmed by the turn of events. She had expected a quick conversation, a follow-up call, maybe even a polite rejection. But this was something she hadn't seen coming. The group around the table exchanged looks, some of them nodding in agreement with Adam. "We've been following your career for years," said another voice from across the room. It was a woman, early 40s, with a sharp look in her eyes. "We know you have what it takes to lead. We've got a fast-growing company, and we're looking for someone who can not only run the show but lead with integrity and vision. We believe you're the one." The words hit Jordan like a wave. CEO. She had dreamed of something like this, but never in a million years had she imagined it would happen this quickly. Never had she expected it to come after being thrown off a plane in such a humiliating way. Jordan took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm flattered," she said, her voice firm, steady, "but I need to understand more about what you're looking for. This is a huge responsibility." Adam smiled. "We know it's big, but we also know you've already faced challenges most people never will. What you went through yesterday, that's the kind of fire we need. You've got the resilience, the smarts, and the vision we've been looking for. We've seen your track record. You've got a gift for turning things around, for leading teams with compassion and strength. That's why we want you." The offer was real. It wasn't a joke or an empty promise. The more they spoke, the more Jordan realized that this was her moment. She wasn't just stepping into a new job. She was stepping into her power, taking control of her future in a way she never had before. "I'll do it," she said, before she even fully realized the weight of the words. It was a bold move, but it felt right. "I'll take the position, but I'm going to do this my way. I'm going to make sure this company not only thrives, but thrives with integrity. And as for the airline..." Her voice trailed off, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. They all nodded, seeing the spark in her. "Let's make history," Adam said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Jordan stood up, feeling more empowered than she ever had in her life. She had been humiliated just a day ago, but today she was in charge. Her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was another message, this one from a journalist who had followed her story. "I'm following your story closely. You're not just a victim anymore, you're becoming a force. We want to tell that story. We want to help you share it with the world." Jordan smiled, her heart racing. This was just the beginning. Jordan didn't waste any time. Within a week, she was in full CEO mode. She had been handed the keys to a company that had been struggling with leadership issues, and it was clear that it needed someone with vision, direction, and a sense of purpose. The board members had been cautious at first, some of them skeptical that she, with her relatively short track record in leadership, could turn things around. But as soon as she stepped into her new role, it was clear she was different. She was not just another businesswoman trying to climb the ladder. Jordan was here to make a statement. Her first day at the company was a whirlwind of introductions, meetings, and endless paperwork. She was bombarded with numbers and projections, but she barely paid attention to any of it. What she was really looking for were the people, the ones who were already working there, grinding day in and day out. She knew that a company's success wasn't about products or services alone, it was about the people who believed in it, and she was determined to get them to believe in her. She called a company-wide meeting on her second day. The employees, some of whom had been there for years, were skeptical. The idea of a new CEO wasn't exactly what most of them were hoping for. A lot of them had seen CEOs come and go, each one bringing their own vision, but nothing ever seemed to change. This time, though, there was something different in the air. Jordan stood in front of a crowded room, confident and unwavering. She addressed the employees, laying out her vision in simple terms. "I'm here to change this company," she began, her voice steady. "But I can't do it without you. I want everyone here to feel valued, to feel heard, and to know that we're all in this together. We're going to work harder than we've ever worked, but we're going to work smarter too. We're going to make this company a place where people not only want to work, but where they feel respected, heard, and part of something bigger than themselves." Her words resonated with the employees. There was no fluff, no corporate jargon. Jordan wasn't there to play games or appease anyone. She was there to make sure every single person in the company knew that they were part of her plan. The skeptics were still there, but for the first time there was a spark of hope in their eyes. It wasn't just about profits or numbers, it was about people, and Jordan was going to show them that. Over the next few days, she met with each department head, asking questions, listening, and offering ideas. She wasn't afraid to dig into the issues that had been ignored for so long. She demanded accountability and transparency, but she also offered a hand to those who were willing to step up and work hard. She knew that to lead effectively, she had to inspire those around her, not with empty promises, but with action. One of her first major moves was implementing a new company-wide initiative focused on diversity and inclusion, something that had been sorely lacking. Jordan's experience as a Black woman in the corporate world gave her a unique perspective on what needed to change, and she wasn't going to waste it. She worked closely with HR to create a training program, to ensure that all employees had access to mentorship, and to ensure that no one ever again felt the way she had when she was thrown off that plane. But she wasn't just making waves in her company. Word was spreading about the new CEO who had come out of nowhere and completely transformed the atmosphere. Journalists picked up on the story, and soon Jordan's name was all over the media. She was no longer just a woman who had been kicked off a plane. She was a symbol of change, a symbol of resilience, and, most importantly, a symbol of power. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from potential business partners, investors, and influencers who wanted to be a part of her journey. The headlines weren't just about the company anymore. They were about Jordan herself, the woman who had taken a stand against racism and turned it into something greater. Back at the airline, Becky's life was crumbling, though she had no idea it was all about to come crashing down on her. In the days following the incident with Jordan, Becky had kept her head down, hoping that everything would blow over. But it didn't. The backlash was immense. Her social media accounts were flooded with comments calling her out for her discriminatory behavior. People were furious, not just about what happened to Jordan, but about the broader issue of racism in the airline industry. Becky tried to defend herself at first. She made a statement saying that she was simply doing her job, enforcing the rules, and that any claims of racism were misunderstandings. but the public wasn't buying it. Videos from passengers had surfaced, showing Becky's condescending attitude toward Jordan, the way she dismissed her politely but firmly, as if Jordan didn't belong there. Her actions were now being scrutinized from every angle, and no amount of backpedaling could hide the truth. The airline had initially tried to stand by Becky, but the mounting pressure from the public made it impossible. Calls for her firing were spreading like wildfire. The hashtag #JusticeForJordan continued to trend, with more and more people demanding accountability for the way black passengers were treated, not just on that flight, but across the airline's entire operation. The airline's reputation was on the line, and they knew it. Becky's bosses were beginning to feel the heat, and despite her attempts to defend herself, the truth was too glaring to ignore. The videos, the reports, the public outcry, it all pointed to the same thing. Becky had acted with bias, and now the company was facing the consequences. One afternoon, Becky was called into a meeting with her supervisor and the HR department. She had expected it to be a routine discussion, a warning, maybe. But when she entered the room, she saw the seriousness in their faces. "Becky," her supervisor began, "we've received an overwhelming amount of complaints regarding your behavior on the flight with Jordan. After reviewing the situation, we've determined that your actions were unacceptable and did not align with our company's values." Becky's heart began to race. She tried to speak, to explain herself, but the words caught in her throat. The meeting was short, and before she knew it, she was being escorted out of the building. She didn't even have time to gather her things. As Becky walked out of the office for the last time, she realized with a sinking feeling that her career was over. The public outcry was too much for the airline to ignore. She had been fired. But what hit her the hardest was that Jordan, the woman she had so arrogantly dismissed just days ago, was now making headlines as a powerful, influential CEO. Becky's mind raced with disbelief. The woman she had humiliated was now running a company, and Becky was out of a job, her reputation in tatters. As she sat in her car, staring at the windshield, a single thought repeated in her mind. How could I have been so blind? Jordan was already making strides as the new CEO, but the opportunity she now had was much more than just about running a company. It was about making real, impactful change. It wasn't lost on her that the very thing that had propelled her into this position was Becky's racist treatment of her. Jordan was determined to turn that negative experience into something that could uplift and inspire others, especially those who, like her, had faced similar injustices. On her first official week as CEO, she organized a major event at the company's headquarters, a day dedicated to transparency and inclusion. She called it the Open Door Forum, where employees, regardless of position, could come forward to express their concerns, ideas, and suggestions. Jordan knew the company had struggled in the past with leadership that didn't listen, and she was determined to change that. The event was a success. The employees were hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect. Many had been through different management changes before, only to be let down each time by empty promises and unfulfilled initiatives. But Jordan wasn't like the others. She listened, she asked questions, and she offered solutions. She wasn't afraid to admit when she didn't have an answer, but she promised to find one. And that honesty struck a chord with the employees. Throughout the day, Jordan moved from group to group, talking directly to the staff, shaking hands, and making genuine connections. She spoke openly about the company's challenges, not sugarcoating anything. She was candid about the changes that needed to happen and made it clear that they were all in it together. The staff began to feel a sense of hope. They started to see Jordan as not just a CEO, but as one of them, someone who genuinely cared about their well-being, their voices, and their future. As the Open Door Forum drew to a close, Jordan made an important announcement. She unveiled a new initiative focused on recruiting diverse talent, with an emphasis on marginalized groups. She explained how the company was creating partnerships with local universities and community organizations to provide training programs and opportunities for those who had been historically excluded from industries like theirs. She wanted to level the playing field and create a culture of equity and empowerment. The room erupted in applause. Jordan could see it in their faces. These people were ready for change, and they were ready to believe in her. They weren't just employees anymore. They were a team, and Jordan was ready to lead them to new heights. As she looked out over the crowd, Jordan couldn't help but think about how quickly her life had changed. Just a short time ago, she was humiliated, kicked off a plane, and made to feel small. Now she stood in front of a room full of people who looked at her with respect, admiration, and trust. The tables had turned, and she was ready to seize this moment and use it for good. Becky sat in her small apartment, scrolling through her phone with a sense of numbness. It had only been a week since she was fired, but it felt like a lifetime. Her world had come crashing down around her, and she couldn't figure out how things had gotten so bad so quickly. She had lost her job, her reputation was ruined, and she could hardly step outside without feeling the judgmental stares from her neighbors. She was all over social media, and not in a good way. People were calling her out left and right. Hashtag Becky. The racist was still trending. The video of her kicking Jordan off the plane had gone viral, and there was no escaping it. She was now infamous, known for her hateful actions, and she hated every moment of it. Becky tried to reach out to the airline, hoping that maybe there was still a chance for her to get her job back. But her calls went unanswered. She even reached out to some of her colleagues, hoping someone might understand. But no one wanted anything to do with her. The airline had made it clear. They were done with her, and no one was willing to risk their own job by associating with her. Becky had spent her entire career working her way up in the airline industry, and now she had nothing to show for it. She had never imagined that her actions would lead to this, that a few moments of arrogance and cruelty would lead to her losing everything. She had thought she was simply enforcing the rules, doing her job. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. She had singled out Jordan, treated her as less than, and now she was paying the price. She watched the news, and there was Jordan, strong, confident, and powerful. The very woman she had humiliated was now being hailed as a symbol of change and empowerment. The headlines read, Jordan Williams takes on corporate America, CEO leading with compassion and strength. Becky couldn't believe her eyes. The woman she had tried to put down had risen far beyond what Becky could ever imagine for herself. Becky felt a wave of regret wash over her, mixed with anger. Anger at herself, anger at the situation, and even anger at Jordan for being able to rise above it all while Becky's own life fell apart. She knew that if she had treated Jordan with basic decency, none of this would have happened. She wouldn't have lost her job, her livelihood, and her sense of security. Sitting alone in her apartment, Becky realized she needed to do something. She needed to change, to make things right somehow. But she didn't know where to start. She couldn't take back what she had done to Jordan, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward. She picked up her phone and began typing, her hands trembling as she did. She drafted an apology, one that she hoped Jordan would see. It wasn't much, and it certainly wouldn't undo the damage she had caused, but it was a start. For the first time, Becky understood that her actions had consequences, not just for herself, but for others as well. She had a long way to go if she ever wanted to rebuild her life, but she knew one thing: she had to try. She posted the apology online, knowing full well that the public might not be ready to forgive her. But this wasn't about them. It was about acknowledging the harm she had caused and taking the first step toward being a better person. As she hit post, Becky felt a small sense of release. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she hoped for at least a chance to change. Jordan's life was now in full motion, her new position as CEO transforming not only her career, but the lives of those around her. The company was starting to thrive under her leadership, and it was all happening at lightning speed. With every decision, Jordan felt more certain of her purpose and her power. The media continued to shine a spotlight on her, and she was quickly becoming a role model for women and minorities who had been pushed to the margins for far too long. But Jordan wasn't just satisfied with external validation. Her true joy came from within the company itself. She saw the shift in the energy of the workplace. Employees who had once been disillusioned now walked into the office with hope in their eyes, ready to contribute and innovate. People felt heard for the first time in a long while, and they knew their voices mattered. It wasn't just about the diversity training or the new inclusivity policies. It was about Jordan's unwavering belief in people's potential. The company's numbers were improving too. Profits were climbing, and new partnerships were beginning to form with some of the most respected companies in the industry. Jordan had turned a once floundering business into one that was now poised for major growth. And all of it had been possible because she wasn't afraid to take risks, to challenge the status quo, and, most importantly, to stay true to herself. One day, as she was preparing for a high-stakes board meeting with investors, Jordan received an unexpected email. It was from the head of a major international company, one that had always been on her radar but seemed too out of reach for someone like her. The email was an invitation to collaborate on a joint venture that could transform the industry as a whole. The proposal was bold, but Jordan had learned to embrace boldness. She didn't hesitate to respond, and within hours she was in a video call with the company's CEO, a powerhouse in the business world. They spoke about the potential of the partnership, and Jordan's ideas were met with enthusiasm and respect. The CEO praised Jordan for her innovative approach to leadership and her vision for a more inclusive and sustainable business model. "This is the future of business," the CEO said, clearly impressed. "We want you to lead this transformation with us." For Jordan, it was another sign that the world was starting to take her seriously. The journey from being a black woman kicked off a plane to being a leader of a multinational partnership was almost surreal. But she had earned every bit of it. This was her time. As Jordan's star continued to rise, the consequences of Becky's actions were continuing to unfold. Becky, now completely disconnected from the airline, had no idea what the future held. She had put out her apology online, but the response had been lukewarm at best. People had commented with everything from sympathy to outright scorn, but there was a sense of finality to it all. Her apology was too little, too late. The damage had been done. Becky's personal life was falling apart. She had always relied on her job for a sense of security, and now, with no real prospects on the horizon, She felt like everything she had worked for was slipping away. Her friends had distanced themselves, some even outright condemning her behavior. Social media users were still sharing the story of her mistreatment of Jordan, and it felt like there was no escaping her past. But then, an unexpected opportunity arrived. An old friend of hers, someone who had been a colleague at the airline, reached out with a proposition. This friend worked in HR for a different company, one that wasn't nearly as high profile, but it could be a fresh start for Becky. However, this wasn't just a friendly offer. It came with a condition. Becky would need to undergo extensive sensitivity training, work on addressing her biases, and prove that she had changed. The offer was a wake-up call for Becky. She realized that she had two choices. She could continue living in denial, blaming others for her downfall, or she could take responsibility for her actions and work toward becoming a better person. After much reflection, Becky agreed to the terms. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to undo the harm she had caused, but it was a start. She knew the road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she had a chance at redemption. Becky spent the next few months in a personal and professional transformation. She attended the sensitivity training, listened to stories from people who had experienced discrimination, and worked tirelessly to understand her own biases and blind spots. She began to understand the deep roots of racism and how it had shaped her worldview in ways she hadn't even realized. But it wasn't just about learning, it was about action. Becky began to volunteer at local organizations that worked to combat racial inequality, speaking at events and supporting initiatives that promoted diversity and inclusion. She knew it wouldn't be enough to just change herself. She had to help change the world around her, too. Her personal journey was a difficult one, full of self-doubt and struggle, but it was also one of growth. And though she knew she could never fully undo the harm she had caused to Jordan, she now understood that true redemption came from acknowledging the damage, taking responsibility, and doing the hard work to make things right. It wasn't an easy path, but Becky was determined to walk it. And while she didn't know where it would lead, she knew that she had started down the road to becoming someone better. The winds of change had swept through both Jordan's life and Becky's, and the public was watching closely. Jordan's rise to power had been meteoric, and the media had followed every step of her journey, from the day she was humiliated on that flight to her ascension to the CEO's chair. Headlines hailed her as a champion of diversity, a symbol of resilience, and a shining example of what could happen when a person refused to let injustice define them. But now, as Jordan's company continued to grow, and her influence began to spread across the corporate world, it was time for a public reckoning. Not just for Becky, but for the industry as a whole. The airline, which had been at the center of the controversy, had remained largely silent about its role in the incident, choosing instead to focus on damage control. However, as Jordan's story continued to dominate headlines, the pressure on the airline to take responsibility mounted. The public had begun to demand accountability, not just for Becky's actions, but for the systemic issues that allowed her behavior to go unchecked for so long. People began to ask, what had the airline done to address racism within its ranks? How many other employees had faced similar discrimination but hadn't had the chance to fight back? As these questions swirled, Jordan knew that she couldn't remain silent on the issue. She had already transformed her company's culture, but this was bigger than just her company. It was about an industry-wide change, about creating a world where Black women and all people of color could thrive without being constantly demeaned or undermined. It was time to take action, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered like she had. Jordan held a press conference that would go down in history. It wasn't just about her success as CEO anymore. It was about exposing the truth and pushing for a systemic overhaul. She stood before the media, poised and unapologetic, ready to address the elephant in the room. "There is a larger conversation that needs to be had," she began, her voice unwavering. "We live in a world where people of color, particularly black women, are constantly subjected to discrimination, microaggressions, and bias in spaces where they should feel safe, whether that's on a plane, in a workplace, or even in a hospital. It's not enough to be successful in our own right if the systems around us remain broken." Her words were clear, direct, and filled with the kind of power that only someone who had lived through the pain could truly understand. She went on to call for a nationwide effort to tackle systemic racism in the airline industry and other corporate sectors. She demanded that companies take responsibility for their employees' actions and create policies that would ensure accountability when racism occurred. "The day I was kicked off that plane," she continued, "wasn't just about me. It was about every black woman who has ever had to question her worth, her dignity, or her place in this world. If my story has taught me anything, it's that we must demand change, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us." The room was silent, every camera trained on Jordan as she spoke with an intensity that captivated the audience. Her call for justice and change was not just for the record books. It was a rallying cry, a plea for every company and every person in power to step up and make things right. Soon after, the airline issued a public statement. They apologized for the incident, and after a full internal review, they promised to implement new diversity and inclusion training for all employees and overhaul their customer service policies. The airline also announced a partnership with several civil rights organizations to address the larger issues of racial bias within the aviation industry. Becky's role in the airline's downfall was acknowledged, but the company's public statement did not stop there. They emphasized their commitment to ensuring that their leadership and employees reflected the diversity of their customers, a goal that had been severely lacking in the past. It wasn't just an apology. It was the beginning of a shift, one that was long overdue. The press conference was a pivotal moment for Jordan. Not only had she called out a major industry for its failings, but she had also positioned herself as a key figure in the fight for racial justice. As the media coverage continued to grow, more opportunities began to open for her. She was invited to speak at major conferences, became a sought-after consultant for companies looking to address racism, and was even offered a spot on the board of a national racial equity organization. The road to this point hadn't been easy, but as Jordan looked out over the sea of reporters, cameras flashing, and headlines rapidly scrolling across her phone, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had taken the pain of her past and used it to create something much greater. She had turned the tables not just for herself, but for countless others who would benefit from her work. Her story was far from over, and she knew that the real fight was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Jordan felt the weight of her journey shift from burden to power. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into an opportunity to change the world. As the press conference ended, Jordan walked off the stage with a sense of purpose and calm. She had made her mark, and now the world would see what came next. Jordan's impact began to spread far beyond her company, and the effects of her leadership were being felt across multiple industries. In the months that followed her press conference, the conversations around race, inclusion, and systemic bias became louder, more intense, and more urgent. Jordan had become a catalyst for change, a symbol of resilience that showed the world what was possible when a person stood up and fought back against injustice. One of the most significant outcomes of her activism was the rise of other black women who, inspired by Jordan's example, began to take their own stand. Many reached out to her, sharing stories of how they had faced similar mistreatment, whether in their careers, in their personal lives, or in everyday situations, and how her journey had given them the courage to speak up and push for change in their own spaces. Jordan was more than just a CEO now. She had become a mentor, a guiding light for those who had long been overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed. She began hosting workshops and leadership seminars where she shared her story, her insights, and the lessons she had learned from her rise to power. The seminars weren't just about business strategies, they were about teaching people to find their voice, to demand respect, and to never let anyone, especially those in power, define their worth. Her influence was undeniable. Major media outlets reached out for interviews, and Jordan's name became synonymous with the fight for justice. She was featured on the covers of magazines, invited to political summits, and even consulted by nonprofit organizations working to dismantle racial inequality. The ripple effect wasn't just felt in the corporate world, it was felt in communities all over the country. Jordan had sparked a movement, one that demanded equity, one that called out every industry that had turned a blind eye to discrimination and bias. The conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms were shifting, and more people were starting to realize that change wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. In one particularly poignant moment, a group of young black women who had been working for years in the tech industry reached out to Jordan. They had faced countless obstacles, microaggressions, unfair treatment, and the constant feeling of being othered in their predominantly white field. They were ready to leave their jobs, fed up with the glass ceilings they couldn't break. But after learning about Jordan's rise, they decided to take a different approach. They decided to fight for change, to make their voices heard in a space that had long rejected them. These women asked Jordan to mentor them, to help guide them through the very challenges she had faced. They were ready to rise up and take their places in the tech world, just as Jordan had done in the corporate world. And Jordan, always eager to pay it forward, agreed to take them under her wing. Her company, too, was thriving. Under her leadership, it had grown exponentially, reaching new markets and forging international partnerships that had once seemed impossible. But Jordan wasn't satisfied with just success. She wanted to build a legacy. She wanted to leave behind a company that wasn't just profitable, but one that had changed the landscape of corporate culture forever. With this in mind, Jordan expanded her focus. She created a foundation dedicated to supporting young black entrepreneurs and providing resources for women of color who wanted to enter leadership roles. The foundation offered mentorship, access to funding, and professional development to help these women break into industries where they had historically been excluded. The foundation became a lifeline for many, and its success was a testament to the power of giving back. Meanwhile, Becky's life had continued on a much different path. After months of personal and professional reflection, Becky had started to rebuild her reputation, though it was clear that she would never return to the life she had known. She had moved to a smaller city, where she began working for a nonprofit that focused on diversity and inclusion. It was a humbling experience, but Becky knew it was necessary if she was going to make any real change in her life. One day, after several months of hard work, Becky reached out to Jordan, asking if they could meet. She had been deeply impacted by Jordan's story, not just as a businesswoman, but as a person. Becky knew she had caused harm, but she also knew she had to own up to it, and perhaps, in some way, seek a path toward redemption. She wrote a letter to Jordan, admitting her mistakes, expressing regret, and asking if there was a possibility for a conversation. Jordan received the letter and, after careful consideration, agreed to meet. It wasn't about forgiveness, at least not in the way Becky might have hoped, but Jordan believed in second chances, especially when someone was willing to take responsibility for their actions. The meeting wasn't easy. Becky was nervous, but Jordan listened patiently, acknowledging the growth Becky had shown. Jordan had moved on from the anger and hurt of the past. Her focus was now on the future. As the two women sat down together, there was no judgment, just an understanding that sometimes people had to face their past to move forward. It wasn't a moment of closure, but of opening, a chance for Becky to finally understand the impact of her actions and for Jordan to see the power of transformation. As Becky left the meeting, she felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't looking for forgiveness, but she had found something even more valuable: accountability, growth, and a deeper understanding of her own role in the world. And while the journey ahead would be difficult, she knew it was the only one worth walking. For Jordan, this meeting was a reminder that her work wasn't just about business success or public recognition. It was about changing hearts and minds, and sometimes that meant offering a chance for others to grow, even those who had once wronged her. The ripple effect that Jordan had started was far from over. It was only just beginning, and its reach would continue to spread for years to come. Jordan's journey had come full circle. From the day she was humiliated and kicked off a plane by a racist airline attendant, to standing as one of the most influential CEOs in the world, she had become a beacon of hope, strength, and resilience for those who had been silenced for too long. Her rise was no longer just about personal triumph. It was about creating a legacy of change that would ripple through generations. The company she led was a model of corporate transformation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion weren't just buzzwords. They were woven into every facet of the organization. Jordan had revolutionized how businesses approached leadership and management. Under her guidance, the company launched initiatives that created pipelines for Black women, people of color, and other marginalized groups to rise to leadership positions. It became known as one of the most inclusive workplaces in the world, setting a standard for others to follow. But Jordan's impact extended far beyond the walls of her company. Her foundation, dedicated to uplifting Black women entrepreneurs, had become a powerhouse. It provided mentorship, access to capital, and opportunities for women who had been denied those same chances in the traditional business world. Through this initiative, hundreds of young women had started their own businesses, breaking barriers in fields ranging from technology to healthcare to the arts. Jordan had always believed that change didn't happen in isolation. It happened when people were willing to stand together and demand it. Her foundation was more than just a charitable organization. It was a movement that shifted the narrative around Black women in business. Her work was featured in documentaries, praised by political leaders, and studied in universities. She had gone from being a victim of discrimination to becoming a symbol of empowerment and a force of transformation. Even as her influence grew, Jordan remained humble. She often reminded herself of her roots, where she came from, and the struggles she had endured. She made sure to stay connected to the communities that had supported her from the start, often visiting schools, speaking at local events, and providing scholarships to students pursuing careers in business and leadership. Jordan's public speaking engagements became an outlet for her to inspire others to dream bigger, to fight harder, and to never let anyone define their worth. She shared her story of resilience, but more importantly, she emphasized the importance of community and solidarity. The fight for equality, she would often say, isn't just about individual success, it's about lifting each other up. And then, one day, as Jordan was preparing for another keynote address, she received a letter. It was from a young girl, about 12 years old, who had watched one of Jordan's speeches online. In the letter, the girl expressed her admiration for Jordan's journey and shared how much it meant to her to see someone who looked like her rise to such prominence. She said she wanted to be like Jordan when she grew up, not just because she was a successful CEO, but because of the way Jordan had used her platform to make the world a better place. The letter moved Jordan deeply. She realized that this was the true reward: the lives she had touched, the dreams she had sparked, and the hope she had instilled in people who had never seen anyone like her in positions of power. She wasn't just changing the world. She was helping to build a future where more young girls, particularly black girls, could grow up knowing they could be anything they dreamed to be. Years had passed since the day Jordan had been kicked off that plane, and the world had changed in ways she hadn't even imagined possible. Racism, while still deeply ingrained in society, was being confronted in more open, unapologetic ways. The corporations, once hesitant to address their roles in perpetuating inequality, were now under constant scrutiny, driven by leaders like Jordan who demanded action and accountability. And Becky? Her journey had taken an unexpected turn. After her time in the nonprofit world and her own work to better understand her own biases, Becky had become an advocate for diversity training in corporate environments. She started speaking at conferences about her own mistakes, using her story to emphasize the importance of empathy, education, and humility. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't about redeeming herself in the eyes of others. It was about truly transforming her understanding of power and privilege. One day, Jordan received an unexpected call. It was from Becky. The conversation started off awkwardly, but it quickly shifted into something more genuine. Becky wanted to tell Jordan how much her leadership and her public stance had changed her life. She thanked Jordan for showing the world that change was possible, even for those who had once been complicit in systems of inequality. Becky had come to understand something that Jordan had known all along. Real change didn't just happen from the top down. It happened when individuals were willing to confront their own biases and take responsibility for their actions. Becky wanted to partner with Jordan on a new initiative, one that would focus on helping corporations implement real change in their cultures, particularly around diversity and racial equity. Jordan listened carefully, and after a long pause, she agreed. She saw in Becky the possibility of redemption, not just for her, but for the larger cause they both cared about. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the future. It was about using their combined experiences to shape a better world. The partnership that followed was groundbreaking. Together, they launched a new project that aimed to provide companies with the tools and resources they needed to not only improve their diversity practices, but to embed racial equity into the very DNA of their organizations. It became one of the most impactful programs in corporate America, with companies around the world signing up to participate. As Jordan sat in her office one afternoon, reflecting on how far she had come, she realized something important. Her journey had never been just about her. It had always been about creating a world where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background. The struggle had been hard, but the work had been worth it. And as she looked out the window, watching the sun set on another successful day, Jordan knew that the fight wasn't over, but it was far from where it had started. She had turned the tables, not just for herself, but for an entire movement of change. Her story had gone from tragedy to triumph, but more than that, it had become a story of hope, redemption, and, most importantly, possibility. And in that possibility, she saw the future of a world where no one would ever have to fight alone again. It had all come full circle. Resilience in the face of adversity, as Jordan turned humiliation into a platform for change. It emphasizes the importance of self-worth, showing that no one should allow others' actions to define them. The script highlights the significance of accountability, with Becky's transformation showing that redemption is possible through self-reflection and action. It also underscores the impact of standing up for what's right, how one person's voice can inspire systemic change. Lastly, it teaches that true leadership involves empowering others and building a legacy of community and solidarity, where everyone can succeed.